in the paper on exceptionalism and theorizing from urban China, I think one of the things I was thinking about when I was doing that literature review, like reading in English, all of this research being done on Chinese cities and how much effort is being put in explaining just really basic things about Chinese cities, or the Chinese context, or governance structures, or institutions. And I think about at what point some of those terms are not really translatable, and why we don't just stick to the Chinese term. There's, the concrete example I'm thinking of is with the hukou. I mean, hukou is like a very specific kind of urban registration thing. It's really not the same as urban citizenship in the broader scholarship on urban citizenship. It falls into like a very different kind of debate, and to just translate it as such, we lose a lot in that translation. And so I wonder, like, at what point we can just stick to the specificity of the word in its original, and everyone else learn what hukou is.
Hukou. Have you ever had a urban thing or a concept or a place that you couldn't quite say in English because it just works so much better in another language?
Happens to me all the time.
Ciao, I'm Michele Couto.
I'm Caitlin Morrissey, and in this episode we are talking global urban studies, comparisons and aspirations.
Welcome to the mini-series Walking the City With, hosted by the Urban Studies podcast. This is a series all about the people behind the ideas in urban research, and we get them out of their lecture rooms, their books, their articles, to quite literally walk the talk with the authors and editors in urban studies.
And we mean literally. We're literally going on walks with these authors. And this is a special podcast because it's the world's first for urbanists, a series that is actually peer-reviewed, so you know the content must be good. So, who did you take for a walk this time, Michele?
So this time we went out with Julie Ren, who's an urban geographer and professor at the University of Amsterdam, a self-described visa queen whose, I quote, love language is feeding people noodles. Julie's work has been focused on how comparative urban research has the potential for redressing the biases on how we theorize cities. She's the author of a very beautiful book called Engaging Comparative Urbanism that tells us great stories about the art spaces in Beijing and Berlin. And I caught Julie on the sidelines of the, prepare for the mouthful, Royal Geographical Society annual meeting. And we got a bit stuck in squeaky gates, windy parks. We talked a lot about imagining the urban in what I think is a pretty honest self-review of Julie's own work.
So how did Julie get into urban studies?
Well, you know what? Let's hear it directly from her. But because our theme in the mini-series is that of walking the city and taking global urbanism out there, I wasn't surprised that Julie took me out on a journey that she herself did too, starting a bit of a theme, I think, in our podcast of the traveling urbanist and the personal reflection. But a little disclaimer, watch out. We might stumble and fall a bit into global urbanism here, and hopefully that's done somewhat safely. Here's Julie.
When I was studying, let's go way back, way back, around 20 years ago, I did my bachelor's thesis about this question of the integration of second and third generation immigrants in Germany. Like, how do you integrate into a society with a broken identity? And I was going through all this literature on the post-nation, about fragmented identity, about multiculturalism in Europe, and so forth. And on the back of that thesis project, I got a Fulbright fellowship to come back to Germany and go a little bit deeper, specifically with regards to my research about that took place in youth centers in immigrant areas of Berlin. And when I was doing that, all of these questions came up around public space, social space, place-based identity. Kept on kind of falling into the scholarship that helped me to kind of better understand where I was in these youth centers, like what these places were, what they meant, about the question of like the appropriation of space by different communities. And this is how I fell into urban studies, because I went to a liberal arts university in the US and there was no urban studies. I don't think we even have geography, right? That was very much a social studies background that I came from. And so I didn't enter into urban studies on purpose. I kind of fell into it. I mean, I think that at the heart of the more global, I mean, this is also not me, right? Not just me. I'm really kind of building on Jenny Robinson's work with my work in a lot of, I think, significant ways. I think that where we are is, like, I think that there's been a huge, like, watershed moment with a lot of critique, a lot of critical engagements with the parochialism of urban theory, about kind of just like the narrow origins of where our ideas come from and how this doesn't quite match up with, you know, where all the cities are and what all the urban experiences are and so forth. And with that, I think we've come quite a ways since I started my PhD to now. So I don't know, I feel like in the last 10 years, there's been so much really interesting critical work that's come out around these questions of how do we theorize? What is urban theory? Like, what is a global urban? Like, how do we relate that to the world or the worlding gesture, right? And all of these things, I think, there we've come really a long way. I think more people are involved as well, like from more different places. I think all of those things are really great. Where I think we haven't come as far is, so this is the but. I think there is still cause for concern, and this is something that also came up today in the couple of sessions that I just co-convened on comparative moments and like building methodologies from now and here. And that but about where there's still work to be done is, I think a lot of it centers around like the position of the researcher or researchers in collaborative relationships, about the terms of engagement, how we do work with others, how we research others, about the work of urban research, comparative research that isn't immune from some of the more fundamental questions about doing research, period. I mean, this is why Linda Tuiwai-Smith and the way that she has written about how research is in indigenous communities a dirty word, right? There's like some old kind of baggage that comes with doing research, period. And comparative research isn't immune from that. And it doesn't mean like just doing comparative research, you're not just immediately global, let's say, right? And I think that there's more to be done.
So through her research, Julie has been able to turn this long-standing critique of the parochialism of urban theory into practice. For example, through her experimental comparison of art spaces in Berlin and Beijing, and biennales in Dakar and Taipei.
Yeah, and well done there with the pronunciation, spot on. Isn't that another one a bit like the hook ho? The biennale is such a hard thing to translate into another concept. But I really like how she tackles heads on the parochialism there. I really like how her and others have been head on, not just into making it a more global urban, but really playing with the more, with the advocacy involved in making the scholarship global and collaborative and not parochial in the way that it deals with urban issues.
I'm going to poke a little further in there because I think there's a sort of interesting tension, and today in the conversation as well, in quite a few sort of recent pieces and conversations too. And I guess sort of one of the tensions that has caught many editors' eyes is sort of this tension between yes, we could and we should generalize, we could and we should find common threads for conversations, or no, we can't, it needs to be embedded, needs to be fit deep into a place, and the place, there's no escaping the place in a sense. And then there's the middle, which if I read it right, you're positively skeptical but mildly happy about.
I don't know.
Exactly. So I sort of wonder if I can sort of tease you into that space and saying, so are we casting away either generalizing or the specificity? Is the middle anywhere useful? Or is it just simply the wrong debate?
Okay, yeah. So I engaged with mid-range theory, kind of borrowing from anthropology, just looking for a way, looking for some direction to go with. Are we stuck here?
We'll see. We'll see. We'll see. We're going to be safe. It's the gate. The gate.
Interest.
Left.
But the middle is not our savior. The middle is not going to fix our problems. I think, I don't know, I have this problem, and I'm sure other scholars have this issue too. The moment I publish something, I want to rewrite everything. So when the moment it's out there, I think, oh, yeah. And that's one of the things that I would rewrite, because I think that is lacking in specificity in like really crucial ways. If the middle is just this kind of anything above the single case and anything below the universal, this really doesn't help us, right? Like you're asking if it's useful. I don't know. How is that useful? So, yeah, if I were to grade my work, if I were to retroactively kind of revise it, I would say this is a bit of a lazy out.
And maybe it looks better going outside than to the writer. But I said I felt it was very elegant. I felt like the way you were using sort of the politics of aspiration as sort of just very powerful way to put that. Can you talk, not me, but anyone else that is listening to, how did you use the expression politics of aspiration? Why a politics of aspiration in that work? And whether you would write it differently now?
That I would not write differently. So this is, so actually I think where I ended my book is where I would really want to start the next one. I think there's a lot that's still unsaid. A lot that's, let's say, I want to kind of disentangle a bit more about the politics of aspiration. So not aspiration as synonymous with just hope or wants or desires, but the politics of aspiration in terms of thinking both the conditions in which one needs to aspire. So what are the conditions that would, facilitate aspiration, or where that is more kind of, there's a greater inclination to want, for instance, and also thinking about the uneven capacities. This is borrowing from Arjuna Padarai, right? The capacity to aspire is not equal among everyone. And so those two aspects, I think I want to grapple with a bit more, actually, in future work about the politics of that, right? So thinking about whose imaginations, whose hopes, whose aspirations come at the cost of whose others, right? Like, which are the ones that then predominate, and how does that work? So, I mean, yeah, this is what I would like to do if I were to write a second monograph.
I think Julie's reflections on theorising for the mid-range as an alternative to universalising theory or generalisation here is so interesting and so generative. She's raising critical questions about what it means to theorise in and with an approach to a global urban studies that is attentive to cities across all of the world's urbanising regions.
Yeah, I think the assumption that we're not global by default, even when we do these sort of very sensible comparisons, it is so honest and refreshing, but it's such an important reminder, don't you think? I think one of the key bits that pops up for me there is the idea of the politics of aspiration, right?
I totally agree. What Julie said about who has the capacity to aspire was really fascinating, but of course it raises some really difficult questions about the tactics for researching, things that are ephemeral and imagined.
Yeah, and I actually think that there's probably no other better place, and Julie says it herself, where we're seeing the politics of aspiration in place, like the place we work in. So the conditions that facilitate aspiration as an academic is such a critical bit that I think, you know what, let's just go back and hear it from Julie about how that plays out into academia.
So I love this quote. This is from Abdul Simone, where he talks about the city is rife with the violence of the imagination. So thinking about like how to study it, so backwards from that, like thinking about like what is being done to the city, let's say. Like, whose doing is it, right? Whose imagination of which kinds of futures predominate? Like, which imaginations have the clout, have the influence to displace the certain presents that are lived right now? And I think those are the kinds of projects I would look for to explore that question. So, yeah, I don't know. I have a grant application. I don't want to talk about it because it's in review.
Painful territory. We're not going to talk about annual appraisals or grant variations thereof. It's good. We're going to presume you get it. And I guess the last two things that I've got go a bit in that direction, so stop me if it's in the grant. But the first one is that I think you've been part of a pretty maybe clear to the outsider sort of project also in changing the imagination of what is an urban scholar. Sort of clearly you've advocated it and created some platforms for sort of just a more diverse set of voices in urban studies. So I wonder, now that you're there, in a sense, how do we open up for a more diverse imagination in urban studies? What are sort of critical barriers to make it more global?
I think for me, I find the diversity frame like always kind of double-edged. So yes, representation matters. Yes, it's nice to have, range of perspectives. Yes, like different positionalities are crucial in recognizing like different ways of seeing the world. Yes, all of that is really important. At the same time, I think that initiatives, let's say, you're asking like, what would have made it easier, and I think that often lands in like these kinds of promotional initiatives that are supposed to be about, which I've taken part in, like promoting, in the German context, promoting more women into the professorship route, promoting, more inclusion, promoting and often those initiatives I find miss the point, and in the sense that there are some structural problems within the university system that leads to exclusion, and promoting in the sense of these kinds of pilot initiatives or highlighting, a profile doesn't really solve those structural issues. And so I feel like with diversity policy, there's like a really slippery slope down to like just tokenizing those others that are now part of the university system.
And this, of course, is a big reality check for us, doing our whole podcast in English.
Yeah, what a refreshing one. Obviously, we sort of need to dig deeper into the questions of language. And actually, there's a piece in one of Julie's recent articles in Urban Studies that really closes the whole article with a bit of a zinger on, and maybe urban scholars should probably learn another language apart from English. So I think we want to hear a bit more about that bit and how do you tackle the question of language.
I did my PhD at Humboldt in Berlin, and years ago, part of getting a degree in geography was a language requirement, a foreign language requirement. That was dropped because of Anglo dominance in academia. And I think about what we lost with that. I mean, of course, English and having a common language can be very inclusive, it can be equalizing, it can, bring us into conversation in ways that are important, with more people also important. But I also think about all the things that are lost in the ways that we no longer put so much weight on learning foreign languages. And part of that is about what we lose, epistemologically. What are the ideas that we lose by not actually reading in other languages, speaking them, being able to think in them? Part of it is also very much more practical. Whose burden is it to do the translation work? And I think if we think about changing the field in a meaningful way, it is not just about listening or not just about giving space, but engaging as well. I mean, the only way that listening makes any sense if we can understand that language in the first place, right? So, yeah, I mean, of course it takes years to learn another language, but I think it's something worth trying because it's also a gesture of effort. And I think that effort means also a lot, even if it's very difficult. I'm moving to Amsterdam next year for a professorship there, and one of the requirements is to learn Dutch. And I take that seriously. I mean, I speak German, so I'm hopeful that it's not too much of an extra. I've heard it's easy coming from German, but I think, making that effort is important. This is not from my book, but this is an example, I guess. In the paper on exceptionalism and theorizing from urban China, I think one of the things I was thinking about when I was doing that literature review, reading in English, all of this research being done on Chinese cities and how much effort is being put in explaining just really basic things about Chinese cities or the Chinese context or governance structures or institutions. And I think about at what point some of those terms are not really translatable and why we don't just stick to the Chinese term. There's, the concrete example I'm thinking of is with the hukou. I mean, hukou is like a very specific kind of urban registration thing. It's really not the same as urban citizenship in the broader scholarship on urban citizenship. It falls into a very different kind of debate. And to just translate it as such, we lose a lot in that translation. And so I wonder at what point we can just stick to the specificity of the word in its original and everyone else learn what hukou is.
Well, lots to learn there. Now, we always ask everyone that we take on a walk to then take us somewhere else. So we're not just in one place, where we go to a place that is meaningful for them. And this time, I asked Julie to take us somewhere meaningful for her, not just a site of study, but just something that really matters for her as an urban scholar.
Yeah, exactly. We see the walk as an opening for understanding a little bit of the behind the scenes of our urban scholars and their work. So where did Julie take you this time?
Well, let's go with Julie elsewhere, not just elsewhere, but elsewhen. So let's jump to West Berlin in the 1980s, just next to the wall.
I think a place that is meaningful for me, I also happen to still be kind of living there, is Berlin. I spent a part of my childhood in West Berlin in the 80s and happened to be there when the Berlin Wall came down. In fact, I was one of the kids at the wall with a little hammer that helped to tear it down. So, Berlin owes me. But I think it's a special place to me because it's nostalgic, right? It's special because I have these childhood memories of West Berlin, of living there, of living with the Berlin Wall. I mean, I was 5, right? And when you're 5 years old, walking alongside the Berlin Wall, it is not the same, I think, as when you're an adult. So for me, it was this beautiful structure full of art and graffiti and colors, and it was a really incredible moment, November of '89, when all of a sudden there were these holes that emerged in this structure that seemed to be indefinite, right? In my imagination, this was never ending. It was infinitely tall, infinitely long, and all of a sudden there were these holes in the wall, and you could see through them, and you could see through into the death strip in this no man's land where there were soldiers, there were people back there, and all of that was really extraordinary. And I can't help but think that that kind of childhood memory really shapes how you experience a place. So, Berlin now, of course, is extraordinarily different in so many different ways. But I do think I can't help it. Every time I cross the border, they have in Berlin, the city put in these cobblestones demarcating where the wall used to be. And every time I cross it, I think about that moment.
We are back in the studio. So what did you take away from all of that?
Well, I think we heard so many interesting things across your walk with Julie, but what really struck me in different ways across the conversation was the way that Julie offers very actionable and pragmatic steps for doing more global urban research and for theorising about cities. And of course, what I took away from what Julie just said was the challenge to learn a new language. And this is, of course, something that Julie has done and is doing herself. But more broadly, I think it puts into perspective the real challenge of actually doing global urban research. But what did you take away from this, Michele?
Yeah, I think it really puts it into perspective, the effort that we need to put in there. And so how much we are in the business of imagination and how much imagination and comparisons are at the core of our work. So I think there is as much a clarion call on what we do, that it is an open-ended, reflexive approach to scholarship that keeps on changing and that keeps on going to the next bit. So I guess with that, there you have it. Julie Ren with a teaser of her work on global urban comparisons and the capacity to aspire. Let's hope she does write that next book.
And if you want to hear and read more about Julie's current work on urban studies, do take a peek through our show notes for some links and dive in.
Yeah, so until the next adventure out, thanks for listening. Thanks for walking the city with us and with Julie. And hear you soon. Walking the City With is a mini-series by the Urban Studies Journal with the University of Bristol and the University of Melbourne, produced by Caitlin Morrissey in Manchester, Julia Macbeth in Glasgow, Kate Murray in Melbourne, and myself, Michele Acuto, in Bristol. Thank you for listening.